Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and this is the first update of the Kharkiv region. The map is still work in progress, so bear with me. But we start out here in the north of Kharkiv city, where we see that the Russians have started their offensive operations. It's reported by Russian forces that these are reconnaissance missions. The Russians are attempting to poke and probe attack the Ukrainian defenses in the area to find out and figure out where their main push should be. This is similar to the start of the Ukrainian offensive, where they launched several assaults across the front with armored vehicles to attempt to break through and check the Russian defenses. Now it is the Russians' turn, so we may see a similar style offensive. The question is the Russians properly prepared and are the Ukrainians properly prepared? If either is not prepared, then it will end sourly for them. Prior to the Ukrainian offensive, I expected it would fail due to the Ukrainians not being properly prepared. This time around, I expect this to be a Russian success due to the accumulation of Russian forces in the area and across the front. The long time they have taken to prepare this and the lack of Ukrainian fortifications comparable to the Zaporizhzhia-Surovikin line. Today we saw the first reports of fighting across the border between Russia and Ukraine, and according to this geolocated footage we see that the Russians have captured the first village of Pilna here across the borderline. It is reported by reliable Russian sources that the Russians have also captured the villages of Streletsya, Krasne, and Borisivka. This in its entirety would be a single day, and it would be a 30 square kilometer advance of the Russians across the front. It is a wide area to be attacking in, and 4 separate villages separated, but we do see that the village of Krasne has several fortifications attached to it. This shows that the Russians are doing this reconnaissance mission in force with both the support of armored vehicles as is reported and massive infantry concentration. The Russians have about 50,000 soldiers concentrated here by the northern border, and additional reinforcements are arriving every hour, as we see this video here of a Russian convoy moving towards the border somewhere in the northern front. While we see that video, we see also there are reports that the Russians have started attacks towards Vovzhansk, where they are attacking through the borderline through Pletenivka. It is reported by some sources that the Russians have captured that village as well, but there is no reliable information so far. I'm waiting for further confirmation. So far, we're seeing that the Russians are focusing their offensive operations in the northern parts to the northeast of the Kharkiv region. It is likely that the Russians will focus their attacks here in the north of Kharkiv to create this buffer zone between the city of Kharkiv and the city of Belgorod to the river line here by the Severodonetsk River. At the same time, it is also likely that the Russians will push through to the northeast to reach the western bank of the Uskar River line towards Dvorishne and Kupiansk here in the western parts of the Uskar River line. So the main focus would likely be here in the eastern part of the Kharkiv region. However, it is also reported by Ukrainian sources that the Russians are making bigger and larger gatherings of Russian troops here in the Kursk and the Bryansk region of the Russian Federation. So with this, we see that it may be a larger offensive than just limited to Kharkiv, but a general offensive all the way from the north across the whole border between Russia and Ukraine, and all the way down south to the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk fronts as well. We see that the Russians continue their offensive operations in the Donetsk region, where they have managed to push through the Ukrainian positions east of Nevelske, capture more fortifications, and move on to the first line connected to Nevelske. So we're seeing that the Russians are continuing their offensive operations into the Donetsk region as well. I expect that the Russians will continue and intensify their offensive operations all across the front, as is reported by Ukrainian sources that the Russians are intensifying their offensive operations all across the front. However, they are not seeing much success as of yet. It is seen that in the northern section of the front line, the Russians have not used their main force yet. They are still using reconnaissance missions and attempting to probe the Ukrainian lines to see what is strong and what is weak. But until we see that the Russians continue, whether they will continue to probe or whether they will quickly move on to the next stage where they will use their main force, unlike the Ukrainians, which never ended up actually using their main force in their own push, gradually being grinded down by the Russians. In comparison, the Russians have a significant air power advantage in their northern section of the front line. It is reported by Ukrainian sources that they're essentially being carpet bombed with constant bombardments of their positions. The Kharkiv region has had an ongoing air alarm for over 12 hours by now, which means it is the longest consecutive air alarm in a single region in Ukraine since the start of the war. The Russian Air Force is intensifying their bombardments across the front. It is also expected that the Russians will launch massive German drone strikes throughout the night and a new missile strike to hit the Ukrainian positions. It is reported that the Ukrainians, whenever they gather their troops in any section in any part of the Kharkiv region, they're heavily bombarded by the Russian Air Force, both FAB bombs and others. And it is reported that there is much more to come by the Russian forces. They have been training the Air Force since the start of the war intensively, and this has significantly strengthened it, and their pilots have received a lot of experience throughout these 2 wars of fighting. The issue the Ukrainians are facing right now is that they have to relocate their reinforcements and their reserves to the Kharkiv region. If the Russians then open another front, they are able to continuously divert the Ukrainian forces. If the Ukrainians have to spread out all across the front, all the way from the Chernihiv region down to the Donetsk region, their forces will be spread out so thinly that the Russians will be able to concentrate their forces in any of these points and break through the Ukrainian lines. So the Ukrainians are facing off with a very difficult decision right now. Where should they move? Where should they defend? The Russians have a significant amount of troops all across from the north of Kharkiv to the south by Zaporizhia. The Russian concentration by Sumy and Chernihiv is not that large yet. However, the reports do say that the Russian concentration of troops is growing by the hour. The Russians have managed to destroy this bridge to the northeast of Kharkiv city, here from the direction of the Severodonetsk River. This is a bridge that was destroyed during the Russian withdrawal in 2022 during the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive. It has since then been rebuilt, and the Ukrainians have been using it to resupply between the city of Kharkiv to the Kharkiv region in the northeastern parts. However, this footage here shows the Russians having blown up the bridge yet again, meaning that the Ukrainians would have to make makeshift bridges across the Severodonetsk River further north, where the river is more shallow and narrow, or they'll have to make this massive detour all across to reach the front, or simply drive by the river line. But we see based on this that Vovchansk has been largely isolated from the city of Kharkiv due to the bombing of that bridge. At the same time, there's no guarantee that the Russians will even use their main force. This could simply be a Maskirovka operation where they will redirect the Ukrainian forces to the north and launch an offensive all across the front line. It's reported that the Russians are starting their offensive operations all across the front line as we speak, as the Russians are preparing to launch offensive operations through the night and in the early morning of tomorrow, as they will attempt to push all throughout the front line from Kupiansk in the north to Robotyne and the Zaporizhia front to the south. We see that the Russians are preparing offensive operations all across the front from the Chernihiv region to the north and the Kharkiv region to the east. The Ukrainians do not know where to expect the Russian push. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.